So NASA was an organization that supported World War One and advocated for the war and stated the responsibility women had to contribute to the war effort. And finally, the National League for Women's Services was formed with Red Cross during World War One, and it mainly served as a volunteer organization, which provided services including providing food, caring for, and transportation for Army members. So the League consisted of two divisions, the Motor Corps and Canteen Division. Motor Corps assisted with transportation services like ambulance, including ambulance driving, litter carrying, first aid, and army cooking. And Canteen Division provided food services during the week of army training, supplying food to soldiers, distributed food like sandwiches, fruits, and coffee. In regards to women's suffrage, the movement and organizations also conducted many protests throughout the war to gain the attention of legislators and most of all President Wilson. And in 1917, New York voted for suffrage, and three states after that. But it would take 2 years after the war, which would give women suffrage. In addition, World War One in America was also amidst the Jim Crow era, and according to nationalarchives.org, 380,000 African Americans served in the United States Army during the war. However, they were banned from serving in the aviation units and Marines, and many Black people faced hostility and discrimination, and furthermore, many white men even refused to salute to Black officers. Black forces had segregated training camps, and according to archives.org, Black soldiers were initially paid $10 per month, from which $3 were automatically deducted for clothing, resulting in a net pay of $7. In contrast, white soldiers received $13 per month, from which no clothing allowance was drawn. So many African Americans believed that their service would alter the society's views upon them and their race, but yet they still faced much hostility and prejudice solely for the color of their skin. In addition, there was a lot of backlash on German Americans, who were a large portion of America's population, and rumors spread about them being spies and against America, and as a result, they were victims of violence like being tarred and feathered or lynched. So there was a social stigma being created against German Americans in associations like books, music, and in the attitudes of the public. Now let's take a look at the economic element during this phase. So towards the beginning of the war, America was well equipped financially since the period of neutrality strongly supported their economy. The total value of U.S. exports to allies grew from $2.4 billion in 1913 to $6.2 billion in 1917, and according to a 1917 study, exports of metals, machines, and automobiles rose from $480 million in 1913 to $1.6 billion in 1916. Exports of food rose from $190 million to $510 million. Gunpowder rose from 0.33 per pound in 1914 to 0.83 in 1916. And this helped the nation when entering the war. In addition, in 1916, the United States became the largest economic power in the world. There was a growth of railroads, which served to be a vital resource of transportation for people and goods. And coal mining was also conducted. Famously, the United States Coal and Oil Company during the 1900s allowed for manufacturing iron, steam engines, and railroads. So the United States had also produced millions of steel. In fact, the U.S. Steel Corporation was the first company to reach $1 million market cap, and America was producing more steel than any other nation during this time. So one of the labor union groups during this time was the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, which was one of the largest radical groups in the United States during the war and supporters of the anti-war movement. They attempted to limit copper production in the West as a form of political protest, but they were arrested and taken down by government laws and restrictions. And they were democratic and wanted to overthrow capitalism and were organized among both skilled and unskilled workers. This group was mostly made of fruit and lumber workers whose jobs were temporary and they were beaten and tortured when protesting. Because of labor disputes like these, on April 8, 1918, the National War Labor Board was established to address the labor dispute issues stirred by the worker fight policy. So the board worked to prevent work stoppages, to prevent any labor strikes that would conflict with the economy, to make the work atmosphere more pleasant and appealing by increasing wages and working conditions, and they created labor contracts for employers in exchange for not striking. They also supported a 8-hour workday and equal pay for women. Herbert Hoover is also a prominent figure when speaking in regards of the economic situation during this war. Hoover, who would later become president in 1929, became named the head of the U.S. Food Administration in 1917. Hoover worked to save and store food during the war by regulating Americans' consumption of food. Furthermore, under his leadership of the administration, consumption and sale of wheat, meat, and sugar and fats were reduced save for the army, and make sure all of America was well fed and there would not be a nationwide shortage, which would potentially cause an economic depression. Some means to achieve this were that the recipes for bread and other wheat-involved items cut down to using 50% of wheat. Sugar was changed to 2 pounds per month per person, and certain certificates were required to sign while buying these items to abide by the food laws. Furthermore, the National League for Women's Services assisted in this administration's effort by working for a department of the administration called Uncle Sam's Canning Kitchen, and this assisted by conserving fruits and veggies, and many schools also contributed to the efforts. There were ideas of patriotism and unity that spread in this effort within not only conserving food, but also a unified effort towards conserving other natural resources that would help the war effort. Now let's take a look at the military element during this phase. So in 1918, 1 year after the war was declared, the worker fight policy was enacted, and this required able-bodied men to either serve in the military or work in some area contributing to the war effort. The Draft Act in May 18, 1917, which is also known as the Selective Services Act, required all men between the ages of 21 to 45 to register for military service and defend the nation during war. And before this, the president had only a small army of volunteers, which was like about 100,000 men. According to history, within a few minutes of this act's effect, 10 million men across the country had registered for service, and this also helped American allies with extra military protection. Another military organization was the AEF, American Expeditionary Force, which was created to field troops in Europe and aid the French and British allies. And this was also commanded by John Pershing, and the AEF won many successes along with Allied forces in various battles. So now let's take a look at these battles. There's the first and last prominent battles of World War I, which will be discussed. The first was the Battle of Chateau Thierry in May of 1918, and this was the first major conflict in World War I for American forces. American forces worked with Allied forces in this battle. German forces, along with German General Erchef Ludendorff, planned this attack to threaten French forces and create a path for German soldiers. The German forces were able to make their way to the Marne River, so American forces mobilized ready for attack on a bridge on the river near the city called Chateau Thierry. Allies were able to stop the German forces and succeed in a counterattack, and on another attack in the same area, French and American forces attacked German forces near the city, which led the German forces to retreat from the area. And so this was a very notable Allied victory with France and one of the first involvements of America in their newly formed force, AEF. The final battle was the Meuse-Argonne offensive during late September to November of 1918. This aimed to cut the German railroad lines and was also a part of the final Allies' offensives during World War I and one of the final attacks which brought an end to the war. So similar to the earlier battle, this was fought in northern France with the Allied forces against Germany. This is known as being the largest and deadliest war of World War I and the most significant battle. The first phase of this attack proved to be a disaster and defeat on America's side, which may have been potentially because of how untrained American troops were in the beginning of the war. The second phase was more successful as American forces were able to attack German forces in Argonne Forest, and the United States had finally gained full power over the land. The final phase led to Allied forces advancing in German territories, which led to the end of World War I. Now let's take a look at the political element during this war. So since there were many Americans who were against America's involvement in the war, the federal government took precautions through legislations to prohibit any event that would potentially cause an internal conflict within the nation. For example, the Espionage Act of 1917 prohibited obtaining information related to national security which could potentially hurt the nation and risk putting lives in danger, and it also made it illegal to interfere with foreign relations and national security. Another example is the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it illegal to speak or write against the government. It was enacted from fears of rebellion and dissents against the war effort, and to create less internal conflicts at this time of war. It was also made illegal to dissent against the Constitution, military, flag, or other governmental elements. It was also legal to go on strikes for labor production, particularly targeting anti-war citizens and German Americans. A Supreme Court case that protected this restriction of speech is Schneck versus United States in 1919, which created the precedence that if speech is intended to result in a crime, or there is a clear and present danger of the speech, it is not protected under the First Amendment. As the Allied victory was becoming more clear and Germany was becoming more and more weak in terms of both military and economy, President Wilson issued his 14 points of address on January 8, 1918, to address his environments for the post-war nation and foreign relations agenda. This was an address to Congress which consisted of 1. Proposal to abolish secret treaties to create safer diplomatic relations, 2. Open maritime freedom for trade and navigation during both times of peace and war. 3. Equal trade conditions and opportunities between nations. 4. Reducing armaments among nations for safety purposes. 5. Importance and civil responsibility of the public having a voice in government. And fast forward to the last point was the creation of the League of Nations, which is an alliance between nations for mutual aid and benefits, and to respect each other's political independence. So through these points, Wilson hoped for stronger foreign policy relations and stronger defense during the post-war nation. So most people agreed with Wilson's point of address. However, his last point was often disputed. As a result, Wilson had pro-League tours where he would tour across the United States to promote Americans to support and join the League of Nations, which was soon created by other foreign nations, and the United States joined later after World War II's destruction. And the League as a whole dissolved in 1946, but Wilson's idea would later influence the UN, which still exists today. World War I effectively ended in January of 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles, and it established the terms of peace after the war, and the main participants in this peace compromise was known as the Big Four: UK, France, US, and Italy. And the Treaty of Versailles was established here, which included the planned formation of the League of Nations, which would be the first international organization whose mission was to maintain world peace. And the Allies did not invite Russia to the conference since the Bolshevik government got into power and refused to recognize the debt due to the Allies during the war and the spread of confidential diplomatic information. This conference and legislations, however, required Germany to surrender 10% of its pre-war territory in Europe and all overseas possessions, limited the German army and navy size, put high-ranking German officials and military leaders in trial and Germany would need to accept full responsibility for the war and cover all finances to the Allies. And according to History.gov, this included